I'm Brandon Staglin, and this is One Mind Brainwaves. It's one of the fastest growing areas of medicine. Some even call it a psychedelic revolution. But what does the science say? How safe are mind-altering compounds like psilocybin, otherwise known as magic mushrooms, or MDMA, also known as ecstasy? And how effective might they be in treating a variety of mental health conditions? One thing is for sure, they're changing the face of mainstream psychiatry. Today, we'll be talking with one of One Mind's scientific advisors, Stanford University's Dr. Rob Malenka, for a report on the promise and potential of medicinal psychedelics. And stick around, later on, we'll check in with our wonderful team at One Mind Cyber Guide for the review of a popular app, which you may have heard of, called Headspace. Here now to bring us up to speed on where things are with the science of psychedelics is Dr. Rob Malenka, the Pritzker Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, where he's also the Deputy Director of the Wu Tsai Neurosciences Institute. Rob, welcome to Brainwaves.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. It's fun to be here, and it's a really great topic to discuss with you.
Yeah, likewise. I can't wait to hear your insights, perspectives on it, and share them with our viewers. And viewers, thank you for watching. If you want to hear from you, we want to hear from you as well. If you have any comments or questions, please post them in the comment section of this webcast at any time. And if you find that you're learning things that might benefit from, if you find you're learning things that might benefit somebody that you know, please share this webcast with them. So Rob, this is a really hot topic, and I know you kind of been in the forefront of guiding research in this area. It's being widely studied right now. What do we know thus far about its therapeutic use and possible benefits of such psychoactive substances, known as psychedelics? Might these drugs that are currently illicit actually be powerful tools for healing?
They certainly might be. And as you pointed out, it's a really exciting time for exploring novel therapeutic approaches to prevalent and severe mental illnesses. And the excitement about psychedelics, which really involve the study of a class of substances that were previously demonized, really got jump-started with the study of a drug I'm sure you and your listeners have heard of called ketamine, which is now being used more and more commonly for the treatment of depression, and it's being tested for the treatment of several other prominent neuropsychiatric disorders. And the excitement about ketamine was, again, one, it represents a class of drug with a novel mechanism of action. Most of us would not really call it a psychedelic. It's defined as a dissociative anesthetic. But what's most exciting about it is that it appears to work very rapidly. As you, in this case, for the treatment of depression, as you and your listeners may know, the standard current pharmacologic treatments for depression, as well as the psychotherapeutic treatments for depression, on average take several weeks, if not several months, to be effective. Whereas ketamine, either administered intravenously or intranasally, seems to work very rapidly. So that's really exciting. And that in part opened the door for starting to study other previously demonized drugs. The current clinical trials, the most public and most substantial clinical trials, are one using MDMA, which is an amphetamine derivative. So again, it's not a classic psychedelic. Some people call it an empathogen, some people call it an entactogen. And an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, deserves enormous credit because beginning, I think it's at least 10 years ago, they started pursuing the possibility of doing a clinical trial using MDMA as an adjunct to psychotherapy for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the field is really excited because there was a recent publication in a prestigious peer-reviewed journal reporting that in I'm actually forgetting, but in a reasonable number of subjects, MDMA as an adjunct to psychotherapy, and we'll talk about that maybe later, seemed to be highly effective in ameliorating the symptoms of individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. So MDMA is the drug in this class of previously demonized drugs, also known as Schedule I drugs. And Schedule I simply means that the regulatory agency that approves the legal use of drugs, the federal drug agency, the FDA, it's the furthest one along in the potential of getting FDA approval. And MDMA, as I said, it's being tested. They're doing another large study with MDMA and PTSD, which is ongoing. The other substance that's probably the farthest along in terms of rigorous, well-designed clinical trials is psilocybin, which is, as you know, is a classic psychedelic, also known as an hallucinogen. And it's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And it has been studied in small clinical trials over the last 10 or 15 years and has shown, but these have been small trials with 8 patients here, 12 subjects here in a wide range of illnesses, which we can talk about later on. But the current major clinical trials are being conducted by a company called Compass Pathways in treatment-resistant depression. And again, it is an adjunct to psychotherapy. And their clinical trial with psilocybin entails a fairly robust and prolonged series of psychotherapeutic sessions, and then 2 sessions with psilocybin, in which the subject is experiencing psilocybin for 5, 6, 7 hours in the presence of therapists, and then additional psychotherapeutic sessions to integrate that psilocybin experience. And Compass just released the first results from what's known as a phase 2 trial. So this was about 200 subjects. And at the highest dose, it looked pretty promising in that patients with treatment-resistant depression showed reductions in their symptoms. That's the good news. You know, within a few days and a week or so after the psilocybin experience, it's not bad news or good news, but they also looked, I think it was, again, I'm not sure if it was 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks later. And the subjects who received psilocybin did show a larger reduction in their depression symptoms. But the truth is only 20% of the subjects showed remission of their depression, and that compared to 10% of patients who received a placebo. So I think the point I would make is, yes, there's active research going on. And I just pointed out, I just discussed the biggest, most well-known clinical trials. There's lots of other clinical trials going on. But I would caution your listeners to understand that it's early days and that we need to, in my view, as an academic physician, we need to do rigorous, carefully controlled clinical trials to really figure out which patients these substances are going to be useful for and which populations and which patients may want to avoid these kinds of therapies. But nevertheless, it is certainly a very exciting time. That's probably more than you needed to know.
Well, thanks for that really comprehensive overview and kind of lifting the veil on psychedelics and what's really going on, you know, in the field of research for psychedelics and what it means. That's super helpful. Thank you. You were talking about a clinical trial, some of which are ongoing, and if somebody wants to get involved in a clinical trial, they might be wondering, what do these clinical trials entail, and how does the process work for participants, and how is it administered, and how are patients monitored?
I mean, you know, again, it somewhat depends on the condition an individual is experiencing, whether it's depression or PTSD. but the standard protocol currently is a series, as I sort of mentioned this, a series of psychotherapeutic sessions with trained psychotherapists to prepare you for the drug experience, to tell you what it might feel like and what you might expect. Then the drug experience, that is for PTSD, it's taking the MDMA, for psilocybin, taking the psilocybin, and then experiencing the drug effects with the therapist in the room with you, sometimes two therapists, and then what's known as an integration session, a session after that drug experience, to help you understand and think about what actually occurred, and and to help you understand how it might have been of therapeutic benefit. They're still trying to figure out the doses they should give. For MDMA, it's somewhat standard. For psilocybin and drugs like that, and we can talk about the other substances researchers are beginning to explore, it's still up in the air a little bit. So for the Compass Pathways trial, they did 3 different doses. One dose, which would be considered a microdose, which is really a dose of the drug. You're not even sure you've taken a drug. A more modest dose, which you probably know you're experiencing something, but it's not the full-blown psychedelic or hallucinogenic experience, and then a higher dose. And that's for psilocybin. And for the Compass Pathways trial, it was only the highest dose that showed some efficacy in reducing depression symptoms. And then all the, there's academic work going on, and it's still the early days. Investigators and the companies that are involved, they're trying to figure out what doses to use, not only of psilocybin and MDMA, but other substances, how to administer them. Should people just take it as a pill? Should they take it intranasally? There are companies working on other ways of administering the drug. Does it have to be given IV? Most of these substances can be taken orally, though. So that's where most places are starting. So I hope that answered your question. And then how can you get involved if you're a potential subject who wants to see if these substances might help you? There are nonprofits like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. There's a nonprofit called USONA, USONA, and on their websites, they list some of the clinical trials that are ongoing, of the companies that are doing this, like Compass Pathways. In terms of full disclosure, on the scientific advisory board for another company called MindMed, which is pursuing LSD as a possible treatment and some other substances. You have to go to the company websites and see what clinical trials are going on.
Okay.
So I hope that addressed some of your thoughts and questions.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very useful guide, for somebody who might be interested in learning more about how to participate in a trial. It gives them some sense of how it might go and how to get involved. Thank you. That's great.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm curious, the work you do in your lab at Stanford involves synaptic plasticity. And I'm very curious, how do psychedelics induce or enhance neuroplasticity, and how might that ameliorate things like circuit dysfunction, maybe even as it relates to addiction, which is your main field of study?
I think that's a great question, the answer to which we still really don't know. And the truth be told, in psychiatry, we actually do have a lot of therapeutic modalities, not only drugs, but things like TMS that really help patients and reduce symptoms. And the truth is, for none of them do we really understand at a sophisticated level how they actually work. But the good news is, because of advances in methodologies of exploring how circuits and neurons are modified by these therapeutic interventions, we're learning a lot more. And as you mentioned, I'm a professor of psychiatry at Stanford. So I'm a researcher who passionately believes if we can just understand more about how current therapies work, at a pretty mechanistic level,
Mhm.
that's the path towards making better ones that are both more efficacious and have less side effects and less damaging possibilities. So in terms of psychedelics, again, you have to think about the specific substance you want to understand, because they work in some ways similarly, but in some ways quite differently. So I have actually done a reasonable amount of work trying to understand how MDMA works. In MDMA, we know targets a protein in the brain that vacuums up a neuromodulator, a chemical signaling messenger called serotonin. And we know that MDMA not only blocks this vacuum cleaner for serotonin, it actually causes it, rather than vacuuming up serotonin, it produces large quantities of serotonin. And that's a big clue, because then we can start trying to make other drugs that work like MDMA at this molecular target, but don't have some of the liabilities. Because again, I think one thing that all of your listeners, it's important for them to understand that drugs are not inherently good or inherently bad. They have targets in the brain, they do a lot of good stuff, but they can do some bad stuff. And so it's really important to understand mechanistically how they work. So in terms of how this massive release of serotonin due to MDMA modifies circuit function, we're beginning to understand that it modifies parts of the brain that are, not surprisingly, that are involved in social behaviors, in mood regulation. But I can't say much more than that. In terms of psilocybin and hallucinogens, it is exciting that, at least in animal research, it appears that they do promote plasticity in the brain in a manner where it actually appears that in certain parts of the brain, they may be promoting the formation of new neuron to neuron connections, entities we call synapses. So there was just a recent paper reporting in a mouse given psilocybin that in part of the brain that's important for decision making, important for mood regulation, some of these neurons in response to psilocybin seem to be making basically more synapses. Now, does this happen in the human brain? We don't know. Is that related to the potential, and notice I'm using the word potential, therapeutic benefit of psilocybin? We still don't know. But the excitement about these drugs is not only that we can give them to human beings and hopefully help those individuals suffering from depression or addiction or PTSD, but we can also give them to experimentally accessible brains and really try to understand how they work. So it's an exciting time in this space.
Yeah, that is exciting to think about how it could be actually assisting the development of new connections between neurons. I'm curious how that translates into somebody's experience. You were talking about a mouse for the neuron research and then a human for the clinical trials, but I would imagine there may be some parallel between the effects on the brain between the mouse and the human. It's speculative, but
no,
probably.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea, that has been put forth by other investigators is that psilocybin, especially, opens up your brain to forming new associations that you previously weren't able to make, and to be able to experience the world around you, both the world around you, which is, let's use the term, the external world or the exteroceptive world, but also what's known as your internal world, your interoceptive world, and how you're experiencing your depression symptoms or your cravings for a drug if you have an addiction problem. And psilocybin seems to loosen up those pre-existing thought processes and connections, perhaps because it's opening up new windows for plasticity. So I can't get more specific. Much more specific than that, but it intuitively makes some sense. MDMA works very differently in the sense that MDMA, and I find this really fascinating, seems to open you up to a more positive and empathic social experience. So you can understand why that might be a useful adjunct to psychotherapy. Somebody who has been resistant to interacting with their therapist, resistant to dealing, in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, dealing with their past trauma and really grappling with the experiencing it and how to deal with it. If they're now more comfortable sharing that with the therapist, it appears to be really of benefit. And we can actually model that in rats and mice and try to understand how that's going on. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear about how it may affect people's ability to connect the maybe the external world with the internal world in a way, in the way they understand it, right? And so
absolutely,
yeah, there's that, like I guess it's a Zen concept or a Taoist concept of all experience is one thing. You know, the external world, the internal world. The idea of dissolving the boundary is part of like the Zen meditation protocol, I think. And so,
well, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And as you know, in the psychedelic community, the lay psychedelic community, there are people pursuing those kinds of ideas. That is meditation, certain forms of meditation, another way of reaching a state that a drug like psilocybin. I mean, they're going to be different, but they're going to be commonalities. And I think you put it very well. A drug like psilocybin has the potential for allowing you to make external, internal associations and connections that you just weren't aware were possible.
Interesting.
Prior to the drug experience.
Yeah, I can see how that could help somebody's outlook in different ways. What this makes me think, what kind of promise do psychedelics hold for treating the conditions like addictions, like opioid, tobacco, or alcohol, for example?
It's interesting you should ask that, because historically, substances, in this case, like LSD in the 50s and 60s, were actually being examined for their efficacy in treating addictions, including alcohol abuse or alcohol addiction, opioid addiction. And then LSD got demonized, somewhat because of what happened in the late 60s with a lot of recreational use. And the federal agencies came in and said no longer. So that kind of research is now happening again. So there's a group at Johns Hopkins who has been studying, I believe it is psilocybin, for the treatment of nicotine addiction, cigarette smoking. And I believe an investigator at Hopkins got the first grant from NIH, the first grant given to study a psychedelic under any context, but in this case, it was specifically, I believe, for nicotine addiction. And there are small clinical trials beginning, some of them have started, I believe, to see whether drugs like psilocybin or LSD might be of benefit for people suffering from opioid addiction or alcoholism or alcohol addiction, and psychostimulants. But again, it's very early days. It may be of benefit, they may not.
Yeah, well, I hope it can start to help people if it is effective and people can access it if it is effective. We've heard reports from people who've experienced it firsthand that have been strikingly encouraging, like positive outcomes in many different studies. And psilocybin is seemingly safe. It's not lethal or addictive in itself, but could the experience it induces offer kind of a life-changing catharsis of sorts, or is it too good to be true, or simply too early to tell?
I'd say it's too early to tell. So it is true that the classic hallucinogens like psilocybin are very unlikely to be addictive. They basically are not, in the sense that drugs like cocaine or fentanyl or heroin or alcohol or nicotine can be addictive. And it is certainly the case that many individuals who have taken drugs like psilocybin or LSD have found it a life-changing experience in a positive way. And that's why they are being pursued as potential therapeutic agents. But my guess is you're going to ask me soon, are there any dangers to taking these drugs? And I do want to caution your listeners that they aren't, it speaks to the point I made earlier. Drugs are not inherently all good or all bad. Every drug, including aspirin, including Advil, that many of us take for our aches and pains, they have a lot of good things they do, but they all have side effects that, depending on your physiology and your experiences, can be harmful. So the caution I would give your listeners is a drug like psilocybin, if not taken under the appropriate circumstances, what we call the appropriate set and setting. Set meaning the psychological space you find yourself in. Are you in a relatively good mood? Are you in a relatively bad mood? Have you had a recent fun event? Have you had a recent traumatic event? So that's the set. And the setting. Are you taking it in a relaxed environment with somebody who can help guide you? Or are you taking it in a stressful, those have an enormous impact on the experience any individual will have when they take substances as powerful as psilocybin or MDMA. And all of these clinical trials, the ones that are well controlled, done by rigorous investigators, have very stringent, what are known as inclusion or exclusion criterion. So the fear that a lot of us who are excited about the potential of these substances have, is that individuals who really are at risk for having something bad happen to them by taking a drug like psilocybin will start taking them. And because they can, in individuals who are susceptible to psychosis, they can flip a person into psychosis. In a person who is actively suicidal, it might help that person in the right circumstance, but in the wrong circumstance, it's what's known in popular jargon as a bad trip. And any of your listeners who are my generation, who grew up in the 60s and 70s, read many articles and were exposed to many movies in junior high school and high school about the dangers of these drugs, because they can cause, let's just call it a bad trip. They can, especially drugs like psilocybin or LSD, if you're not in the proper set and setting, it can make an individual who's prone for these kinds of experiences go down that black hole into, to be honest, to despair and suicidal ideation and perhaps even psychosis. So again, as a healthcare professional and an academic at Stanford, I have to say I am not an advocate for people going out into the community and finding sources for these drugs and just taking them without the proper supervision. I think that there are some dangers to doing that.
Thank you for that warning and for that very well-balanced view of the potential benefits and the risks also of psilocybin and other drugs like that. And what you said about how it can kind of amplify, you didn't say this, but I interpreted it this way, whatever your mood or set mindset may be, it just amplifies it and makes it much more pronounced and profound, it sounds like. So
that's exactly what it does. That's why in the current trials, if you remember what I said, all of the current trials, there are many sessions with a psychotherapist to prepare you for the experience. It's not as if the subjects of these clinical trials just get the drug. They have hours of preparation with a professionally trained psychotherapist.
Like training to be an astronaut in some ways. You
Yeah,
got to really prepare for it.
A little bit. That's why they call it, especially for psilocybin and LSD and classic psychedelics, they call it going on a trip. So
yeah,
because it puts your brain in a state that you have probably never experienced before. And that's what's so exciting about it. But that's why I think we need to be a little cautious about how we approach this topic and these substances.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that I think you said MDMA had been approved or was close to being approved by the FDA for, was it, what did it, sorry, where do these drugs stand? PTSD, yeah. Where do these drugs stand in the FDA approval process?
Yeah. I mean, just to clarify, it's the furthest along towards possible FDA approval. So MDMA and actually psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression have both been given what's known as breakthrough designation by the FDA, meaning if they are efficacious in these clinical trials, the FDA will consider approving them in a more rapid fashion than they traditionally do. And the hope is that if the next clinical trial of MDMA with PTSD subjects goes as well as the first, that the data may be presented to the FDA. It's still going to be a year from now, probably in early 23, a little over a year from now. The challenge and what everybody interested in this topic is anxiously looking forward to is how the FDA will decide to regulate the first MDMA and psilocybin. Because remember, I said these are given associated with psychotherapy. So the question is, how will the FDA try to regulate the psychotherapeutic intervention? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. What kinds of training will the psychotherapist have to undergo, et cetera, et cetera. And so both the academics involved in this work and especially there are literally over 50 to 70 different companies pursuing these substances, mostly small biotechs, a few larger companies. They are all trying to figure out what's going to happen with the FDA.
I can imagine.
It's going to be very interesting.
That'll affect their business. Yeah.
Yep.
This is really fascinating. But you talked about how it's been given this special designation by the FDA for more rapid approval if the trials go well. These drugs were once considered dangerous and the science was once considered fringe, as we've said, but is there a danger in fast tracking, doing research too much too fast now? How to safeguard so that the research is done safely and productively? And I guess the FDA would have to regulate how the meds are used safely and productively.
I think, again, I am speaking from my background as an academic psychiatrist working at Stanford. I'm not concerned about the academic or even the biotech or pharma community moving too fast, because they will do, in general, well-controlled, scientifically based studies in clinical populations or in the appropriate preclinical models. I and others of my background have concerns that the understandable excitement in the lay community and the plethora of opportunities for individuals to take these substances from well-intentioned, sometimes well-trained, sometimes not well-trained therapists out in the community, especially places like the Bay Area. While the intention is honorable and good, all it will take is a few bad outcomes, a few, I hate to say this, a few suicides while somebody's on psilocybin, people getting it and leaving it in their getting these substances illegally, because remember, these are still legally Schedule I substances. It is illegal, except in a few cities where they've been decriminalized, to have these substances and all that all it will take is somebody leaving it on their shelf in their kitchen and some little kid taking it and some bad stuff happening. So I'm not worried about the research moving too fast. I actually think we need the research moving at a very vigorous pace because there is so much interest and excitement among the general population. So, and that takes funding and that takes a cohort. So I hope I'm answering your question. So I think the danger is just too many people getting on the bandwagon and not understanding the risk-benefit ratio. That there's potential benefits, but there are some serious risks.
Yeah, and there's so much potential here in this line of research that if there are negative stories about it in the press and due to awful things happening with the people who are not careful enough, then that may derail the potential that could happen. So
I mean, that's exactly what happened in the 60s and 70s. People were starting to research this and progress was being made, but then there were a lot of bad incidents in the late 60s and 70s, and the federal government stepped in and made everything illegal. And those of us who do think there is a lot of potential in using these substances therapeutically and also using these substances as windows into the brain and its capacity, don't want to repeat what happened in the late 60s and 70s. We want to build on the momentum that is the reason we're having this conversation, and build on that and build up the infrastructures and the appropriate research endeavors so we can really study these substances over the next 10 years and hopefully add them to the armamentarium of new therapeutic interventions for serious mental illnesses. Because as you know, there's a lot of excitement about transmagnetic stimulation as a treatment. And this is a really exciting time. But we need to do the research to figure out what works and what doesn't. So even with ketamine, the truth is we don't know how many times you can give ketamine and it will still have a therapeutic effect. We don't know if you take ketamine 10 times, whether there may be any side effects that we need to watch out for. It's really early days in these kinds of the study and use of these kinds of substances.
Absolutely, let's handle this with extreme care and
well, that's my view.
Yeah.
I'm not sure everybody agrees with me, but that's my view.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing your view. It's really helpful for me to hear and our viewers to hear too. In terms of protocols and accessibility and affordability, do you foresee psychedelic therapy as more of a boutique mental health solution if it does pan out, or would it help to further democratize mental health care in some ways, making it equally available for underserved populations?
I would love it to be the latter. That is, I would love it to be a mechanism by which we can democratize mental health delivery and mental health care. But the truth is, my hunch is, for all sorts of reasons having to do with how we pay for and deliver healthcare in our country, I think it's very likely, should these drugs show therapeutic efficacy, they'll start out as boutique kinds of drugs where because the big issue, as you know, is will insurance companies pay for them? And it's unclear that they will. A lot of insurance companies won't pay for ketamine at this point. They won't pay for TMS. So my hunch is they'll start out as boutique treatments for, not unfortunately, but for people who are educated, who have the financial resources to pay for it. And it's unfortunate, but that's okay, because if it works, then it will become more available to the general population. I mean, and the reason I say that is we're getting a little bit off topic, perhaps, because it's all about insurance companies and what they are willing to pay for. And this gets back to the earlier point about how the FDA is going to regulate this. Because currently, the way these substances are being given, you need many, many hours of psychotherapy to prepare you for taking these substances and then to understand the experience after you've had it. And as you know, a lot of insurance companies have not supported psychotherapeutic interventions, which can be really valuable, as much as they should. But something that you are interested in, there's a lot of interest in the community, both the academic and the business community, about eventually combining novel interventions like psychedelics with digital forms of monitoring and therapy. And that
Mhm.
may be a way of democratizing and making these kinds of therapies more accessible. And that may be the future over the next decade.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm really curious to learn more. Does that what does the future hold for psychedelic research and ultimate deployment, hopefully, and what gives you hope for this field overall?
I mean, what gives me hope is the the level of excitement, both in the academic community, and to be honest, I'm excited that there are so many biotechs really interested in this. And I'm somebody who doesn't demonize the industry, the biotech or pharma industry, which are in it for are profit-making entities. But if you look historically at how new therapeutics get to the masses, you need companies and the resources they bring to bear to make a lot of these therapies accessible. So I'm excited by that. And I'm excited that in the academic community, studying these substances is no longer seen as, for lack of a better word, it's not seen as crazy or not mainstream. It's still a little bit not mainstream, but it's coming into the mainstream now. And I think the combination of the business community's interest and the academic interest and the excitement in the clinical community interested in brain disorders. And it's not only psychiatric disorders, it's things like something that One Mind is very interested in. It's issues like brain trauma. There are trials going on to see if psychedelics, assuming they are plasticity promoting, might help with the recovery from brain trauma. There's actually a company in Canada pursuing this. So a lot of excitement. And that's why I think we're going to see advances reasonably rapidly over the next 5 to 10 years.
It's great, this kind of perfect storm of elements coming together to start to accelerate this process, and hopefully it's done carefully and judiciously, as we've talked about so far. This may help a lot of people who experience these more serious conditions like TBI, like treatment refractory depression and PTSD. Yeah, I really hope that it'll help a lot of people through these really dark times that they go through.
We all hope that passionately. It would
Yeah,
be, very satisfying and great if that turns out to be the case.
definitely. Rob, thank you for sharing your perspective and your wisdom with us today.
Sure, my pleasure.
Great to hear, it coming from a professor at Stanford University like yourself, someone so knowledgeable about this, the lowdown on how things really are and are not in the psychedelic research field. And viewers, thank you too. Thank you for watching today. You've probably heard of an app called Headspace. We were mentioning meditation earlier as something kind of similar to the experience of psychedelics in certain ways, but Headspace is a meditation app. Now, here's our team at One Mind Cyber Guide with their thoughts on this popular mental health app that aims to improve thoughts, anxiety, depression, and sleep. Take it away, Cyber Guide team.
Hello, my name is John Bunny, and I'm a digital mental health specialist at One Mind Cyber Guide. We spend lots of time talking to people about mental health apps, what they like about them, and what they don't like about them. In our research, we've heard from lots of people that one barrier to using mental health apps are concerns about privacy and security. This is understandable, as in some cases you might be entering sensitive, private information about your well-being, which you don't want other people to see. Just like any other technology you use, you should only use apps you trust and are confident in their ability to protect your data. Any app you use should have a privacy policy that informs you about how the app handles your data. In a recent study, we found that over half of apps for depression don't have a privacy policy. You can check for a policy in the App Store at the bottom of the app page. If an app doesn't have a policy or you are unsure of the security of the app, avoid using it. At One Mind Cyber Guide, we review privacy policies to check if key pieces of information about what happens to your data are covered in the policy. We believe developers should be as transparent as possible about how they handle data, so you can make informed choices about the apps you use. Headspace helps users to develop skills around meditation and mindfulness. The app's core feature is a series of animated videos which walk the user through a variety of meditation exercises. Consumers can select topics of interest to them and add recordings that they enjoy to their favorites. There are specific individual meditations available, as well as entire courses centered around broader topics such as grieving, happiness, and relationships. There are options to do quick, bite-sized meditations in the SOS section, and meditation timers for those who are simply needing a timer for their meditation practice. Users can also join a group meditation with others in a virtual space. In addition to these meditation options, Headspace offers specific sections to help consumers with their sleep, with exercise and physical activity, and for work and productivity. Consumers can also search for meditations that they might need in a given moment. Finally, consumers can review their history of meditation exercises and various other statistics to understand their progress in learning mindfulness and meditation skills. Headspace is one of the highest scoring apps on the One Mind CyberGuide app guide, scoring 5 out of 5 on credibility and 4.97 out of 5 on user experience. It has acceptable transparency around data security and privacy. We also have a professional review of Headspace where you can read more about the app from a clinician's perspective. In our mental health resources section, you can also read more about Headspace with pieces like 5 tips for using Headspace. Also, check out our blog pieces from our team on their experience using Headspace for a month. Stay tuned next week for another app review.
Thank you, CyberGuide team. Thanks also to Dr. Rob Malenka. And don't forget, you can post questions and also check out all of our past Brainwaves episodes at onemind.org/brainwaves. You can also sign up for our e-newsletter to be alerted of any new Brainwaves episodes coming out and other activities of One Mind. Everyone, thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.
My mother has had depression most of her life.
My uncle committed suicide when he was in his 30s.
I live with bipolar.
Now, more than ever, it's the world's leading cause of disability. Yet research to improve mental health lacks the attention physical health research receives. Visit onemind.org. From the lab to the front lines, accelerating brain health for all. Help us fund new treatments at onemind.org.